For over 800 years, Rome stood strong. Unshakable, majestic, surrounded by the idea that no enemy would dare touch its heart. It was the eternal city, the symbol of absolute power, the center of the known world. But all of that changed one August morning in the year 410, when its once sacred walls were crossed not by treachery, nor by the art of war, but by desperation. Alaric, the leader of the Visigoths, did not come to Rome as just any invader. He was not a bloodthirsty barbarian, nor a savage in search of glory. He was a man shaped by the empire itself, a commander who had grown up speaking Latin, serving in Roman legions, learning its customs, and embracing its faith. All he asked for was a place for his people, recognition that would make him part of what he admired so much. But Rome did not listen. Proud, arrogant, blinded by its own past, it responded to sacrifice with contempt, and to dialogue with silence. And when the silence became unbearable, Alaric chose to speak in the only language that Rome understood, the language of force. That night, the roar of the Visigoths echoed through the cobbled streets of the capital, not as an act of revenge, but as the lament of a broken dream. For the true plunder of Rome was not for gold or power, it was the price of having denied humanity to those who only asked to belong. Childhood and formation, the germ of a leader. Alaric was not born on a throne or under the banner of a great city. He was born on the margins, in a world on the border between barbarism and civilization, between the ice of the Danube and the golden promise of Rome. His homeland, Puus, a forgotten island north of the great river, was far from being a center of power, but in its rivers and forests grew something that Rome never fully understood: tribal pride, ancestral memory, and hunger for respect. He was part of the Tervings, a proud and ancient branch of the Visigoths, who survived amidst wars and displacements. His people did not seek to destroy empires, but to live with dignity within them. And from a young age, Alaric saw Rome as more than a threat, he saw it as an aspiration. Many Goths hated the empire for its past betrayals, but not him. He admired it. When he was still a child, his tribe made a deal with Emperor Theodosius: Rome would accept the Goths within its borders in exchange for military service and loyalty. It was then that Alaric first saw the interior of the monster, and he was fascinated by its order, its architecture, its language, its armies. He received Roman instruction, learned Latin, was baptized as a Christian, though of a heretical doctrine in the eyes of the official church, and marched at the front under banners that were not his own. He fought for the empire. Brothers died beside him. He served with honor. But each victory did not bring the Goths closer to the dream of equality. Rome used them. It applauded them in battle, but despised them at the negotiating table. And so, while Alaric was forming himself as a soldier, he was also awakening as a leader. He was not just strong. He was intelligent. Observant. He understood the cracks in the Roman system. He knew that the division of the empire between East and West was not just a political strategy, but a real fracture. He saw child emperors and corrupt bureaucrats clinging to power, without vision or honor. He understood that Rome was no longer an impregnable fortress, but an empty shell held up by arrogance. And in that scenario, the young Visigoth began to imagine a different future. One in which his people would not beg for recognition. One in which they would not have to kneel before those who needed them more than they admitted. One in which, if Rome did not give them a place, they would take it. Rise and disillusionment, the warrior Rome never wanted to acknowledge. When Alaric came of age, he was no longer just a young Goth educated in the shadow of Rome. He was a commander, a natural leader, respected both by his men and by Roman officers. His language was Latin, his armor was Roman, and his sword had proven loyalty in more than one battle. But no matter how much he tried to appear Roman, he would never be to the empire. His first major act as a military figure occurred during the Battle of the Frigidus River in 394. Emperor Theodosius, ruler of the East, was facing a rebellion in the west led by Eugenius, a usurper who had gained the support of pagans by restoring ancient temples and forgotten symbols. To crush the rebellion, Theodosius marched with an army reinforced by more than 20,000 Goths under Alaric's command. It was a massacre. Theodosius did not hesitate to throw the Visigoths into the front lines as cannon fodder, sending them on a suicidal charge that would open the way for his main troops. Thousands died. Men who had trusted Rome. Warriors who thought they were fighting for something more than gold. And when the battle ended, when the smoke cleared and victory was celebrated in Constantinople, the Goths were ignored. There were no honors, no lands, no names engraved on marble columns. Just silence. For Alaric, that was a deep wound. Not only for the loss of his brothers, but for the systematic contempt his people were subjected to. They had proven their worth, their discipline, their dedication, but they were still seen as useful barbarians. As war dogs thrown meat while the need lasted. That humiliation would never leave him. And then, something changed. Alaric stopped dreaming of being accepted, and started demanding it. When Theodosius died in the year 395, the empire was divided between his two sons, Arcadius in the east, and Honorius in the west. 2 children, 2 crowns, and an empire in ruins. In this power vacuum, Alaric was chosen by his people not just as a commander, but as a king. The first to hold this title among the Visigoths. He was no longer a general in service of Rome. He was a sovereign. And his loyalty was broken. What followed was not a blind revolt, nor a thirst for destruction. It was strategy. Vision. Alaric knew the cracks in the empire, and began to press with intelligence. He crossed the Balkans, sacked strategic cities, avoided unnecessary confrontations, negotiated, and waited. He wanted a new treaty, a fair one. He wanted land, provisions, security for his people. And above all, he wanted respect. But Rome, as always, did not listen. It sent threats. Empty promises. And when they finally offered him a military title, it was quickly taken away again. For Alaric, this was no longer a negotiation. It was an unsettled account. Stilicho, betrayal, and the march toward Italy. In the year 402, Alaric crossed an invisible line. It was not the first time a barbarian army had set foot on Italian soil, but this time the world felt something different, a real threat. It was no longer about isolated tribes. It was a disciplined army, led by a leader with tactical intelligence and clear political goals. And worst of all for Rome, it was a leader who knew the inside of the monster better than anyone. His march through northern Italy was not a wild outburst, but a surgical move. He cut off routes, controlled passes, tested the response capacity of the legions, and met little resistance. The Eternal City trembled, not because of the looting, which had not yet come, but because of the uncertainty. What did Alaric really want? What he demanded was clear: a permanent place for his people within the empire, political legitimacy, and an official title as Magister Militum, the rank that would place him on par with Rome's greatest generals. He was not asking for more than what he had already proven to deserve. But the ruler at the time in the west was Stilicho, the skilled general who had protected the frontier for years and understood better than anyone how dangerous it could be to underestimate the Visigoths. Stilicho, of Vandal origin, had built his power through the sword and diplomacy. He saw in Alaric an uncomfortable adversary, but also a potential political tool. Therefore, instead of crushing him, he offered a truce. He defeated him twice, yes, but did not destroy him. He allowed him to retreat. To many, it was a mistake. To Stilicho, it was a long-term play. Perhaps he thought of using Alaric against his rivals in the east. Perhaps, even, they shared more of a vision than they admitted. Both were foreigners in an empire that no longer trusted even its own generals. But fate has its own rhythm. Problems at the borders multiplied, Vandals, Suebi, and Alans crossed the Rhine, rebellions erupted in Britain and Gaul, and the young emperor Honorius, hiding in Ravenna, seemed more like a spectator than a ruler. Gold became scarce. Urgent decisions were replaced by intrigue. Stilicho tried to negotiate with Alaric. He even promised a future agreement to attack the east together. But the Roman Senate, divided between fear and pride, categorically refused to give an inch more to the Visigoths. They accused him of treason. They called him a conspirator. And they executed him. With his death, Rome lost its last capable general. And Alaric lost the last opportunity to achieve his goal without resorting to total force. Now, there were no more excuses. Rome would have to listen. And if it didn't, he would make it listen. Rome, the day the eternal city fell. The air grew heavier in Rome when it was learned that Alaric had returned. Not with ambassadors. Not with offers. With an army. With hunger. With determination. It was the year 408. Emperor Honorius, hidden in Ravenna, remained unaware of the gravity of the situation. But in the streets of the Eternal City, rumors were louder than the bells. It was said that the Visigoths were already close, approaching like a silent shadow. No one slept peacefully. And then the siege began. Alaric completely surrounded Rome. 13 gates shut. The Tiber River blocked. Food ran out day by day. Wheat, water, salt, began to be worth more than gold. The city that once fed the entire empire could no longer feed its own children. The stench of death flooded the streets. Corpses piled up in the squares. Hunger turned into fury. And fury, into desperation. Alaric knew this. He didn't need swords. His best weapon was patience. Finally, when Rome was on its knees, its leaders begged to negotiate. They offered him tons of gold, silver, silk, pepper, and slaves. Alaric accepted, but not out of ambition. He did it because he still wanted to resolve this without destroying the city. But Emperor Honorius, far away, refused to fulfill part of the deal. He would not name Alaric commander of his armies. It was the final insult. And then the unthinkable happened. On August 24, 410, someone, perhaps a sympathizer, perhaps a traitor, opened the Salarian gates from within. And for the first time in more than 8 centuries, Rome was invaded by enemies who didn't come to take power, but to make themselves heard. The looting lasted 3 days. It was not a senseless bloodbath. It was not a barbaric massacre as many had feared. It was surgical, controlled, almost respectful compared to what it could have been. Alaric ordered the protection of Christian temples. He prohibited unnecessary bloodshed. He allowed civilians to seek refuge in churches. But yes, there was fire. There was looting. There were screams. The mansions of the nobles were emptied. Hidden treasures were uncovered. Symbols of eternal power were reduced to dust. And yet, the soul of the city did not die there, but it did change forever. Rome was no longer invincible. Rome was no longer the center of the world. Rome had fallen. And Alaric, the Goth who only wanted to be Roman, was the one who made it possible. Alaric's last journey, death, legend, and legacy. Rome had fallen, but Alaric's story was not over yet. The sack was not a victory. It was a resigned sigh from a man who no longer had any paths to take. After abandoning the Eternal City, Alaric headed south to Italy. His gaze was set on Africa. There, in the empire's grain-producing province, he hoped to find the resources needed to feed his people and ensure their future. But the sea, like Rome, turned its back on him. A storm devastated his fleet before they even set sail. The plan collapsed. And while he reorganized his army and searched for a new route, death surprised him. Alaric fell ill in the city of Cosenza. He did not die by the sword, nor in battle, but alone, defeated by a silent fever. It was the end of a life that had defied empires, that had shaken the foundations of the world, yet still had not found its place in it. His funeral was not ordinary. According to legend, his men diverted the course of the Busento River to bury their leader under the waters. With him, they placed part of the loot from Rome, and perhaps his greatest treasure, the loyalty of his people. Then, the slaves who built the tomb were killed, so the secret of his resting place would never be revealed. No one has found that tomb to this day. After his death, leadership passed to his brother-in-law, Ataulf, who would lead the Visigoth people toward a new destiny. Not in Italy, nor in Africa, but in Gaul. There, in the Roman province of Aquitaine, they would establish the first barbarian kingdom within the empire, an autonomous state, ruled by Gothic kings under the lineage of Baltos, descendants of Alaric. It was the beginning of something new, something that no longer depended on Rome's permission. The sack of 410 not only marked a turning point in the history of the empire. It also planted a seed. Since then, everything that sounded like a Goth, something dark, something savage, began to be feared. Gothic architecture. Medieval horror literature. Even the modern subculture that carries its name. Everything traces its roots back to that moment. To that march. To that man. Alaric I, the barbarian who didn't want to be an enemy. The warrior who only wanted to belong. The Gothic chieftain who was rejected by Rome, and made it kneel.